Thank you. Thank you for everyone coming. Really appreciate everyone. It's not as cold as it was yesterday, a little bit warmer. We've got Glen over from Canberra and he's looking for a bit of warmer weather, so we're happy we've got a little bit of weather. That's good. But thank you for coming along. This cybersecurity breakfast we've put on is not meant to be too long, it's just a brief update as to what we've been seeing in the market, what we've been seeing in the world, and just trying to help you understand why this is a problem and why we need to be talking about it. We've had probably 20 years of people wanting access to their data in their business. They want it fast, they want it everywhere, and they've got exactly what they wanted. Now they've got access to all their data from everywhere, and so do other people. So this is now part of the conversation we need to start having is, how do we make sure that that's secure and safe and your businesses are protected? So what do we do? How do we do that? And what are you looking for? What's something that you might just spark your interest that's a little bit different? So what we wanted to do is talk a little bit today around what we've seen. So I'll talk from a local perspective in South Australia, and Glen's going to talk from a more of a global perspective to just open your eyes to what we're seeing and what's actually active and happening out there. So hopefully that will give you some guidance. So my talk's around about 20 minutes, and then I'll hand over to Glen, which is around about the same. So we should be finished up in less than an hour, but feel free to ask any questions. Interacting is always welcome. So if you don't understand, just stick your hand up and we'll talk through it. So one of the first questions that we like to talk about is, when is cybersecurity finished? That's the correct answer. Never. It's somewhat similar to having a child. Yes, they may grow up, but they're still always your child. You're still always there, and you're still working with them. Even once they're mature, they're still there and someone that you're working with. It's something that is not static that you can put in place, like a road or some infrastructure. It changes because the things that are coming at you from a threat perspective is people, and people are clever. We're clever, they're clever as well, and they keep changing and trying to work around what we put in place to stop them. So it's an ever-evolving situation that we just need to keep working through, and that's why I'd like to tell you about what we've seen, as opposed to this is what you can do. It's something that you need to think about from that point of view. So what's one of the first things that we've seen really that cost money? And I'll start with something very small. It was back in 2016, there was a small local hotel, and they got the email and they clicked on it and they got ransomware. I'm pretty sure everyone here has heard of ransomware. Yep, it's nothing new to anyone, that's just become mainstream threat now. It was one of the first ones that we saw hit, and they were really scared. It didn't affect production. The point of sales and the bars and the keynote, they were all working. It was only the administration side of the network that actually was hurt. And just remember that, because it's very relevant to what Glen's going to talk about later. But it did impact them. And instead of doing something about it, they thought, oh, well, I'll just pay the ransom. And they did. And it cost them about $2,000. And they got their keys back and it unencrypted their data, and they continued working, and they said, that's it, I'm done, I'm fixed. It's not a typo. The comma and then the second 2K was because the bad guys went, hey, these guys are a good target, and they hit them again 1 month later. And they paid second time. We no longer look after this company, and I'm assuming that continued again and again, because I said if you can't take that seriously, I think maybe there's someone else that might be better to look after you. But if you continually pay someone, they're going to come back. So that's something to think about when hospitals and other ones get attacked. It's very hard for them to consider, what do we do? Do we have things in place to recover from this? Or do I have patients that are in theatres and are in beds that are going to be affected by this? It's a very stressful moment for the IT department when they're faced with these situations, and we see this happen again and again. So the one lesson that we learned from the first time is, if you pay, they'll hit you again. So be aware, watch, be careful. What happened with the second attack that we saw? Well, this was in 2018. It was a waste management authority, and it was a little bit more complicated than just a simple email. It was actually nothing to do with their systems at the start. That they actually received an email from someone else that had been actually breached. And that interaction started happening from the other breach side, and they started asking for information, got a little bit of accounting information, which allowed them to then actually breach the waste management authority. So it was a two-pronged attack. Hit these guys over here, and then we can use some information to get into the main source that they're looking at. So there was a bit of a supply chain attack. Now, what we saw here was the accounts department actually got breached because they worked out who this person was and figured out what their password was. And then they watched. They did nothing. For about 90 days, they just watched. And then they saw when the accounts were leaving the business, and they watched. And as soon as all those emails went out on that day saying payment is due, the next day they sent an email saying, oh, the bank account details have changed, and everyone paid. So that was the first breach, and that was $20,000 that they just never received. They didn't know because they waited 4 days, because they had someone that would normally pay quite quickly, and they rang them up and said, hey, this is strange, you normally pay. So I'm talking about looking for behaviours, looking for things that are different. And they said, oh, we have, here's our remittance to your new bank account. That's the alarm bells, that's when we knew something went bad. So we were called in, we helped them clean up the mess, and somewhat disappointingly, we found that the accountant email password was capital P A-S-S W-O-R-D number 1. In 2018, her password was password 1. We all laugh, but it cost them $20,000. So we fixed that, we cleaned that up, we gave her an appropriate password. She was explained why that was a problem. Formal warnings through the business, money was lost. We thought that was okay. 3 months later, the exact same thing happened again. Someone accessed the email system, they changed the banking details 1 day after the emails went out, and that time $40,000 was lost. And we thought, okay, this is something different. This has to be something different. We've been through this, all the staff understand. And we look in, and there was a single login to the email account. There wasn't a brute force attack, there wasn't multiple attempts. One time, bang, straight in. So we go to this person and we say, have you changed your password? Yeah. Yeah, the other one was really hard to remember. Wouldn't happen to be password 1, would it? Yes. What do we learn from this? We learn from this that the weakest link in your company is your staff. We can put automation, we can put security systems, we can put monitoring, we can do all these things. At the end of the day, it's about your staff and what they click on. Take from that and learn. Third breach. This was a food distribution organisation. Again, they were not actually breached in any way. Their systems were completely fine. Their staff had actually gone through an education process where we sat down with them and shown them what to look for, had them understand what was real and what was not. And yet they got an email from someone that was for sponsorship payment. So they would regularly sponsor this organisation. It was just this month's payment that was due. It came from a valid email, the letterhead was correct, the footer was correct, and the actual invoice was correct. But the bank account was different. Everything else was completely identical. And they had an internal process that if anything changed, a second person had to look at that, and a phone call had to be made to the company the money was going to. Through interesting reasonings, that second mission fail-safe process never happened. The phone call was never made. The second person was never asked to check. They just looked at it, updated the bank records, and made the payment. And it wasn't until a month later when the organisation rang up and said, "We don't have your sponsorship payment, is there any problems?" And they showed them the remittance and the email, that they realised that the other company had actually been breached. But again, it took a month for someone to say there's something different, there's something wrong. What do I do about this? And again, we saw a human failure. All the automation and computer systems that we can put in place, a person didn't follow the process. And that's why the cyber attack was successful. We noticed that there was not a second. They learned from that, they listened, and today that has not happened again. And they are very anxious people and are very, very careful with their emails, and they send me everything that looks slightly dodgy. So they are being educated and listening, which is good. The fourth attack, quite considerable. This was very complicated. This was over a 6-month period. It was a retail distribution that is in South Australia, but they actually have an office overseas in Asia. The Asia side of the business moves things from Asian manufacturing into Asian retail sales, which gets around some tariffs, and they pay some administration fees back to South Australia. It's around about $500,000 per month that they're moving back, so it's a substantial amount of money. What we saw is the actual email address that someone was started to talk to people from Hong Kong to South Australia wasn't the email address, it was just slightly different. You've probably seen this where you get a .com instead of a .com.au, or you get one of the letters, so Google with the number 00 instead of the letter 00. Those sort of things can be very hard to pick up when you're busy and you're just trying to work through emails every day. So they set up this new one and started talking to people in Adelaide. And then they set up one in Adelaide and started talking to the people in Hong Kong over a 6-month period. And so there was these long email chains going on. And then the fake email address started talking to the fake email address. And they created a CEO and a CFO account in both the fake emails with this long chain of transferring money to new and different bank account details. And then right at the end, they flipped it over to here and said, this is where you need to transact all of your monthly takings now. The person that received the email just saw the CEO and the CFO with this long trail that they're on the end of and said, okay, that must be the way it is. This is the bank account that we're using now, and transferred $500,000, which never got there. And Adelaide's going, where's our money, guys? And they're looking and they're going back and forth and they're saying, I did it, it's been done. Problem is, the people in Adelaide had actually been talking to the fake Hong Kong account, not the real account. And the fake Hong Kong account was saying, oh, we're having money problems, we're waiting on our suppliers to pay us, it'll just be a little bit longer, it'll be a little bit longer. So they're saying, yeah, no worries, that's fine. And then the Hong Kong guys over here are being told emails from the fake CFO, yeah, we've got your money, everything's fine, let's transfer next month. Another $500,000 went out. That took a long time to figure out and understand, to be clear with them what happened. I guess the disappointing thing that we found out is this is part of a global organisation, and it's the third time it happened to them. Once in America and once in Europe. And then the third time they hit Australia. What do we learn from that? Well, back in 2016, they were successful, so they came back. 2018, they were successful, so they came back. 2020, they were very successful, so they came back. If you do have a security breach, be hyper aware they're coming back because they got paid. And if you haven't been, assume they're trying. 2021. I couldn't pick which one. There's been so many, so horrific. I just couldn't pick which one to actually put in there. But it's increasing. It's increasing in number every day. And we're not seeing the simple emails where you get an email that's from Adelaide City Council with a parking fine for $12 with a really blurry icon, and they can't even spell their own council name. They're very good now. Everything is high res, high quality, targeted. I'm very surprised we haven't had more coronavirus outbreak notifications from SA Health. Be aware, have a look. I'm sure they'll come, and you need to be very aware of where they're coming from. They're coming from sagovernment.com, nowhere.com.au. Watch for these things, be aware, and be very vigilant. They're very, very good at making them look real. Any questions with any of that? I could stand here and tell you stories all day, but it's just, it all come back every time. It came back to people not looking at what they're doing, being busy, and just trying to get their job done in the day, and missing something really simple, really easy. So make it a part of your conversation as much as hitting your KPIs and making sure the business is running and hitting your targets. You're being safe. None of those KPIs and targets make any difference if your business is offline. That's what I wanted to share today. All right, so that's from a local perspective. That's just Adelaide. What I'd like to do is now hand over to Glen, who's going to start talking about things from a global perspective and why that actually means anything to you and what you can learn from that. So,
thanks, Wade. We're all probably thinking of a bunch of stories from arising from some of those examples you just gave. Just from a local perspective, just while sitting here, I know there's a couple of Telstra people. So, in the last 24 hours in Australia for the telco industry, I'm just looking at botnet activity. So that tells me, a botnet tells me someone's actually been, their end device has been compromised, and I see that connection coming out of the control server. So Trick Botnet, in the last 24 hours, I've seen 3,094 connections. Andromeda Botnet, Mariposa, these are all pretty hardcore crimeware type botnets. So, even locally, 3,000 people at the moment we just see compromised, and that's just from the Fortnet start, let alone all the other infrastructure around the place. So this stuff's prolific. That Trick Bot that I said, the 3,000 ones, it started out just doing like banking trojans in a web browser session. So that's how I sort of started out in the early days, just from a financial perspective. But now it's like modularised, and criminals use it for a whole bunch of things. Like they'll distribute ransomware, like Wade said before. So yeah, things are getting pretty frightening in terms of volume. And just one other story that Wade reminded me of. Back when I was the IT security advisor for the ATO about 6 years ago, we built this massive big box to basically crack passwords. So we got all the latest, I forget what it was, but it was the latest and greatest video we stacked up about 6 of them, and one of the guys brought it up a rack and we had a fan to do it all cool. And we had like a password file, it was about sort of 12 megabytes password file. I just had like a dictionary with normal dictionary words, and then we'd use a few permeations. That's Wade said, like little one on the end of every word, or substitute the an I for a exclamation So I had a few different variations. And we managed to compromise a device when we went to pen test. We dumped the security accounts database. And this great big box that we built to brute force passwords, we didn't even really need to use it because we just got so many hits on just the normal regular passwords that we didn't even have to worry about waiting for whatever it was a month to brute force these passwords, and it's too easy. Okay, so getting to the story. I'm Glen Maiden. I'm based in Canberra and I run Fortiguard Labs, which is the threat intelligence organisation of Fortinet. In terms of my history, just briefly, I grew up in the defence environment, firstly in the infrastructure space, and then in about 1999, I went to the Australian Signals Directorate. So I was sort of in the signals intelligence organisation for a number of years, doing a lot of sort of cybersecurity intelligence operations, intelligence analysis, reporting, all that sort of thing. It was fun. I then went to, from an intelligence perspective, I went to the Defence Geospatial Intelligence Organisation. So we were using geospatial intelligence to support things like troops on the ground in Afghanistan, looking for command wire IEDs, all that sort of thing. So that was a really, really good intelligence role out of cyber, but just making sure that cyber made a difference. So that's sort of put me in good stead for my role now, which is trying to make sure that the intelligence that we get is actually relevant and usable for our customers and our partners like you guys. In terms of Fortiguard Labs, this is like, you'll see this slide in most of our sales decks. I'm not going to sort of spend too much time talking about us, but if you imagine those stats that I just gave you before, we've got about I think it's about 6 million pure firewall devices all around the world, in pretty much every country. So all those devices are actually pushing telemetry back to our data lakes, largely in North America. And that lets us do a whole bunch of analysis then in the middle. But besides that telemetry, we also work with people like law enforcement, we work with NATO, Interpol, those sort of people. So we're really big on partnerships and threat sharing. So we'll share sort of, it's well beyond sort of 200 pieces of value-added threats per day. So we work very, very closely with all these different organisations to try and get a whole bunch of information into our labs. And that's where we do the analysis. So my team's sort of based across about 40 countries. There's a few of us that have come from sort of a government and intelligence and security background like me. We've got data scientists, we've got computer scientists, a whole bunch of people. And the idea is to sort of go through that big data, process it, and for the most part, build sort of things like narrow rules, things like smart signatures, and a whole bunch of other sort of processes and policies that we then push back out to the Fortinet fabric. But one of the cool things as a byproduct is we're able to look very, very closely at that data we've got, start to sort of build up a bit of a picture and get a bit of an idea of the threat actors, their tactics, techniques and procedures, and things like some of the indicators of compromise. So we can then give that to and share it quite happily with our partners and our customers, and in some cases our competitors as well, just to say, well, we've seen this happening, we'll align to something like the MITRE attack framework, so it's nice and standardised, industry standards, not proprietary. And that can be rapidly ingested into someone's security operations, processes and use cases. Someone said that they were for a site here. This is just some volumetrics. I won't take too much time here. I'll just point out, I'm pretty sure most of you all are quite technical, but zero day, I'm going to be talking about that a little bit when we talk about hafnium. But a zero day is basically a vulnerability in a piece of hardware or software that no one's discovered yet. And if I have access to a zero day vulnerability and I'm able to exploit it, there's no patch, there's nothing you can do about it. So that's something that will potentially give me remote access or unauthorised access to your box, and you as an organisation victim can't do much about it. And then just a million terabyte of sort of threat samples that we've got. We've got a zoo, we've got this massive big bunch of racks, but one of the 42 RU racks has got a big padlock on the front, and I've stood in front of it in Vancouver, but that's got sort of nearly a petabyte of the nastiest malware in the world. So I'm just going to go really, really quickly today. I'm going to talk about sort of 3 of the big breaches that I believe have sort of changed the world, and I'll talk about why. 3 of them are quite different attacks. So I'm going to talk about sort of hafnium, I'll talk about SolarWinds, and then the Colonial pipeline incident that we saw just in the last couple of weeks. And then talk about sort of mainly the so what. So I don't want to sort of delve too deep into the anatomy of these attacks. If anyone wants to talk about that, or afterwards, I'm happy to do that. But I'll talk about sort of what the why of these attacks and why I think it's impacting, and then looking at sort of some of the responses to these attacks and where that's going to be relevant to our business in Australia. So a lot of it's coming out of the US, admittedly, but I'm starting to see real changes in the way we approach cyber in Australia from a, I guess, a legislation and a policy perspective, and even from a geopolitical perspective. You know, I saw Maurice Payne on the news the other day saying SolarWinds, it was the Russians. But that's pretty new to have that level of attribution, certainly from an Australian government, but from anyone to basically say with a bit of confidence this was a bad guy. So hafnium, what is hafnium? It's a Chinese threat actor. They've been around for a long time, hitting mostly American-based targets. So, you know, they've hit people in fintech, they've hit people doing medical research, but they have been around for a fair bit of time. But the key issue for this one was the hafnium attack sort of just started around January this year. We didn't know about it. In March of this year, Microsoft released what they call their Patch Tuesdays, some critical patches for their on-premises version of Exchange server. So there's 4 of them. Now, the frightening part of this is that patch got released and everyone patched those servers sort of after that sort of March the 3rd day. But the indications are that this hafnium threat actor, which was thought to be associated with the Chinese nation state, had actually been exploiting these zero-day vulnerabilities for since at least January the 7th and possibly earlier. So these guys have been very, very active before any of us knew about it. The key original part of it was they get access to these Exchange servers, and the key motivation was stealing email. So they basically clean out the email boxes on all those Exchange servers. What they've also done, though, as well, which I don't think was as highly publicised, is they uploaded what's known as a web shell, which is a really lightweight, basically agent that you put on that Exchange server that will give you persistent remote access to that server. So basically, if any of these boxes have been compromised before the patch, and even after this patch potentially, that web shell still could be sitting on that server, giving that Chinese threat actor remote access to that server to this day if they haven't managed to, if the victims haven't managed to identify and remove that web shell. As I said there, so 30,000 potential victims in the US, but 300,000 worldwide. I think I've pretty much just sort of talked through that anyway. But basically, initial compromise, they managed to exploit that zero-day vulnerability with their attack, get remote root, upload their web shell, and have then enduring remote control to that particular server. And the good thing about web shells, they're quite common. The Chinese threat actors love them because they're quite difficult to detect, because they'll sort of sit normally in memory. You don't necessarily need to even have them sitting like this. And the traffic to and from the command control servers is just sort of sitting in all web traffic. So again, quite hard to detect. Now, SolarWinds, we've all heard about this one. This is an interesting one. Enterprise management software. I have to confess, I haven't actually heard of SolarWinds before the breach. That shows I've been sort of out of that IT management space for too long. But it's basically an enterprise management platform used by about 300,000 organisations worldwide. They're saying that it's used by about 425 of the top 500 Fortune 5 companies in Australia, and could impact more than 18,000 customers worldwide. The threat actor, again, you'll get back to the attribution. This is called, sometimes known as Cozy Bear. These guys are associated with the SFB. So that's basically in the old days when it was the KGB, since the fall of the Russia. A lot of their foreign intelligence services have sort of split up. But anyway, the SFB is their foreign intelligence service. So that's who these bad guys are associated with. Wade mentioned before, what's global and what's local. We knew that they hit a whole bunch of the American data. This is my Fortiguard Fortiguard Labs telemetry, this is how much activity that we've seen. So if you look at Australia, even though all the reports said, oh, this is mainly a global case, we're sort of seeing medium to high activity associated with some of the indicators of compromise for that particular attack. So this was not just related to the North America alone. This hit us all globally. Now, this is interesting in terms of the timeline. This one's really, really quite interesting. The initial compromise was way back in September 2019, and that was of the SolarWinds organisation itself. So what the Cozy Bear actor did was managed to get access to the SolarWinds. They basically implanted or impregnated into the SolarWinds Orion software. This is the source software, their malicious code. So the idea being there is, and this took them all the way through to about here. So they were busy in the background. Wade mentioned before the 90-day sort of wait time on some of these really stealthy hackers. So these guys took their time, they got it right, and then from about sort of February last year, just about this time last year, SolarWinds customers, like we do with our iPhones or our Windows updates or whatever else, the SolarWinds Orion platform called home and said, I need to update, get me more patches. Download the patches. Within that patch was the malicious code, which gave the Cozy Bear threat actor access to all these different customers that were running the SolarWinds Orion platform. Now, the interesting thing from a detection perspective, this is pretty hard to detect. And when it first was reported, you guys have heard of the company FireEye, cybersecurity company. No one had actually detected it, but FireEye reported in about December of last year that all their hardcore red team tools have been stolen by a threat actor. The red team tools is what the pen testers use, basically as their toolbox to do their pen tests, so basically when they're hacking into the customer. So the bad guys got hold of this massive big cybersecurity company's crown jewels, if you will, and then they just said, oh, well, how'd they get in? And it was basically through this SolarWinds breach. Another interesting thing, Wade's point about sort of good hygiene, the reason that the FireEye organisation detected this particular breach is they were using multi-factor authentication. Sorry, one of the FireEye users said, oh, I didn't actually ring up to request my token to be reset. So the threat actor was in there trying to reset the multi-factor token so they could do sort of continue secure activity. Another interesting thing about these guys is they waited for so long. Once they actually did compromise that end victim at the end of the supply chain, they didn't do anything for 2 weeks. So it wasn't quite the 90 days. But for 2 weeks, they just sat there, they sniffed traffic, they looked around, they did a couple of really stealthy pokes to see where they could sort of get out of some DNS and those sort of things. Did nothing. So once they felt they were safe, that's when they started to do that sort of lateral movement and looking for everything they could to basically get their footprint in other infrastructure. But also, look at what else they could steal. From a tradecraft perspective, one thing that was really interesting to me was in my days when I was sort of doing pen testing type activity, if I managed to get access to a box, dump the local account database, brute force it or crack it or whatever, and if I could get like an admin privilege, I'd be like, yes. And then I'd be just going everywhere and just sort of, running amok. These guys were much smarter than I ever was. So they would say, well, it's not usual for user Glen to be going through and looking at the accounting department, just for example. Just they looked and they used the user accounts of someone that was an accountant. So, again, really, really stealthy, making sure that they didn't raise too many flags. I'll be really quick here. This only came up on Twitter on Monday. But this is interesting. Someone posted 8 months ago, within that sort of SolarWinds, there's some stuff that I've seen my McAfee software detectors being a little bit weird. No one did anything with it, but there was indicators posted on the web as far back as 8 months ago. And this is going back to our fabric story from a Fortinet perspective. We need to make sure that the tools and the processes we've got for our SOC users are easy. Now, the final one that I want to talk about, and I'm going through this really, really quick, is Colonial Pipeline. This happened about sort of 3 weeks ago. It's the largest pipeline in the US, about 5,500 miles, all the way from Texas through to the east coast of USA, probably about the equivalent of Adelaide up to Brisbane, maybe. I don't know, it's a long way. Anyway, that was on May the 7th. There was reports that this colonial pipeline had been the victim of a ransomware attack. Anyway, they did the exact right thing, to be honest. So they normally, when you find an attack, you want to isolate it, make sure it doesn't spread. So they took those systems down that were affected. Unfortunately, from an IT perspective, it also spilled over into the OT perspective, and the pipeline was shut down because of some of those management systems. Now, the cynical view out there is that one of those IT management systems was a billing system. So, while the actual OT or the operations technology of the fuel pumps themselves and the pipes themselves wasn't damaged, the IT bit of it, which was the financial billing component, they couldn't actually charge for the fuel while pumping. So that's why they shut it down. Those last pictures down at the bottom. I spent a lot of time in North Carolina, that's why I sort of laugh at that. But when that pipeline was shut down about 2 weeks later, that's in Charlotte, North Carolina, chaos ensues. People think it's a good idea to put petroleum in plastic bags in the boot. But when we talk about cyber, it's so interesting that one small thing, and this was completely, these dark side guys have come out, so these guys are not like the state-sponsored actors in the last two examples. These guys are just a purely criminal gang, only motivated by profit. Apparently about $2.5 billion per year is their revenue stream, not bad. But they've basically said, not politically affiliated, don't care, we're just completely motivated by money. So yeah, things, they don't care, all care, no responsibility. Now, the rumour is that Colonial paid them in 75 bitcoins, which at this time is worth about $5 million. Now, that's not confirmed, but apparently they paid up to get some of their infrastructure decrypted. That's just sort of the rough timeline there. This one's interesting because it was just sort of quick. From a cybersecurity incident perspective, this one's actually pretty boring. It's garden variety ransomware. It's only a single organisation. All they want to do is get the money. The only interesting thing about this from an example perspective is that it actually had those real world hardcore sort of follow-on mainstream effects.
So just out of interest, do these organisations tend to wait for glitches in the world, like coronavirus, to really push?
Yep, absolutely. The threat actors, I won't talk about it. Yeah. That's so agile. So we had this in Fortiguard Labs. Quickly can I touch on the story? A lot of the attacks that we see, so you imagine a firewall, that's the perimeter of your organisation. So a lot of the attacks we see, people putting the perimeter with their remote exploits, trying to blast their way in. We saw about I think it was about 100%, just as the lockdowns happened, the coronavirus pandemic was ramping up. We saw about 100% decline in these particular perimeter-based attacks. Anyway, we've got another view of the data, which we call virus. So basically, that's attempts to get into our laptops and our endpoints. Same time, there was about 120%. Just in that sort of March, April, May timeframe last year, we saw 120% uptick in that attacks against the sort of people's phones, people's laptops. So we also saw for a little while, like the Google search trends. So you search Google, I want my vaccination. That's a legit search term. For a while there, the malicious websites that were using those terms were actually more than the legitimate ones. So yeah, you're 100% right. These threat actors are absolutely opportunistic, and they'll take any chance they can get to shift their operations. And their agility is incredible. So just sort of quickly before I do wrap up. So as I said, the interesting thing about dark side was the OT side. From a Hafnium perspective, I mentioned this before, the most interesting thing for me there is we had a threat actor, extremely aggressive, and they had unfettered access to all those thousands and thousands of victim organisations for all that time before anyone knew. In terms of the SolarWinds, that is probably one of the true textbook advanced persistent threat. You've probably heard that over the years, but the advanced persistent threat is highly motivated, highly sophisticated, well-resourced, highly capable, nation-state-backed threat actor. So the SolarWinds actor is 100% an example of that. The other frightening thing for me about the SolarWinds perspective, I mentioned a little bit about some of their tradecraft when they were sort of roaming around these different networks. But you imagine if I was sort of sitting in a SOC and like that Twitter post, if I was looking and I saw some activity associated with SolarWinds Orion client.exe. Now that's legit, we're running that software. That's just made a connection using the SolarWinds proprietary protocol to the SolarWinds update server.com. That's completely legit. That's streaming traffic. I don't really know what that is because that's proprietary. So I'm going to look at that behaviour and that activity. Looks pretty legit to me. So from a SOC perspective, I actually not going to throw any stones at any of the SOC analysts out there that missed that. This would have been easy to do, especially if you're really busy. And even you saw the one guy or girl that did post about it. Just no one in the world actually picked it up. And I'll just sort of just to sort of bring this back a bit locally. This is sort of the conclusion of my talk today. I mentioned before, I haven't seen the Australian government so sort of wanting to be so involved in not just protecting governments and government departments and even sort of state departments, but we saw this executive order come out from Biden. So after Hafnium happened, going back sort of a couple of months now, there was a statement by the White House is going to coordinate a whole of government US response. So they came out about sort of Friday before last with this presidential executive order, and it is broad reaching. So basically they're going to set up a body now, which is almost like an aircraft investigations level sort of style of body, to go through when we see these big outbreaks, to get in there with a whole bunch of sort of federal powers, federal jurisdiction, to get in and work with some of these companies, whether they like it or not. They're also looking at things like any supplier, and so whether that's a vendor like Fortinet or whether it's a partner like Calibre One, has to have a full development life cycle. So these requirements are absolutely huge. I mean, I know from Fortinet's perspective, we're not too bad because we are a security company first and foremost. But you imagine if you're someone like SolarWinds, you might not have something like secure development life cycle. You might not have your access and identification set up properly. You might not have role-based access. You might not have complex password enforced. So this is actually huge. And then, so I don't know what the effect of that executive order is going to be on Australia, but I do know that the critical infrastructure legislation that's going before Parliament next month or the month after, this is absolutely significant. And this is, I've been speaking to a whole bunch of our customers about just how big this is going to be. So in the old days, in the 2018 legislation, it was basically electricity, gas and water ports, and they had to do a few little things. They had to maintain a register with Home Affairs. They had to report if something happened, so that's some mandatory reporting obligations. And the minister may ask them for in the tax in the business tax, but the minister may ask them for information if they're reached. Now, with this new legislation that's going before Parliament this year, that's expanded not just from water, gas and ports, so this is going to be communications providers, financial services, data storage and processing people, defence industry, higher education and research, energy, food and grocery, healthcare and medical, space technology, transport, water and sewerage. Pretty much everybody is now going to be applicable as a critical infrastructure entity under this act. And probably the little people they won't care about, but certainly some of the big entities. And the requirements are not just for, as I mentioned, you maintain a register. There's actually active requirements. You have to have a security risk management plan. You have to have an incident response plan. You have to exercise these type of plans. You have to do things like penetration testing. So I haven't seen before the government, in response to some of these things, be so, I guess, forward-leaning in terms of going out, attributing and basically naming and shaming the threat actors, and then forcing a whole bunch of our organisations within Australia to comply with some really, really quite onerous legislation. So this is going to be a really interesting year. And I probably took more than 20 minutes, sorry, so I'll leave it at that. It's going to be interesting times ahead, and thank you.
Good. Thank you, Glenn. I really appreciate that. Thanks very much. I haven't provided some value here all. It's just more helping you to understand that it's getting worse. It's not something different. Say something. If someone is doing something and it's a little bit strange, or they're saying something that's different, do something about it. Call out to your IT provider or Fortinet or whoever you're working with. Do something that can actually save you before we see the big things taken down. So hopefully that was good, and enjoy the rest of your day.
I hate scaring people.
Yeah, that was scary.
Wade was meant to go last because, yeah, there's nothing I hate more than some purple.
No, but it's good to hear.